Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. We're going to dive right into some troubling news out of Gainesville that was released on Wednesday afternoon. This is from News4Jax, a News4Jax report on their website. It says Florida Gators quarterback Jalen Kitna was arrested on Wednesday on child pornography charges, according to the Gainesville Police Department. On Wednesday, police said members of the GPD and the Internal Crimes Against Children Division served a search warrant on a residence on Southwest 38th Drive after the police department received a cyber tip from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, indicating that a Discord user distributed an image of child sexual abuse material through its platform. Investigators said that they learned the two images were shared via Discord from the Southwest 38th Drive residents and that the probable Discord account holder was Kitna. According to the police department, a detective interviewed Kitna at the residence, and Kitna stated that he remembered sharing these two images but believed them to be legal since he found them online. Kitna advised that he realized he should not have shared these two images based on the reaction from the other Discord user that he shared them with. The police department said in a news release. Kitna said that shortly after his Discord account was deactivated and that he assumed someone reported him to Discord, according to the police. Kitna stated that he received an email from Discord stating that his account was deactivated due to a violation of terms of service, GPD said. According to the police, Kitna's electronic devices were seized as a part of the search warrant, and preliminary analysis of the devices revealed 3 additional images of child sexual abuse material. Police said that they then arrested Kitna, 19, on 2 counts of distribution of child exploitation material and 3 counts of possession of child pornography. Well, difficult news here on the Jalen Kitna front. It's just difficult to hear across the board here, but your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what to say in circumstances like this. Certainly, I think the first thing is that I don't really care about football when it comes to this sort of stuff. This impacts people. It's the people that I'm concerned about, and I want to make sure that if your first thought or even your second or your third is about how this impacts Florida's quarterback room, we need to do a little bit of prioritization and make sure that we bring it back to the people who are really important in this. And I do think it's important to say that these are allegations. It's not a conviction. So, we've heard one side and it's an ugly side, but, we as a society can often rush to judgment without all the facts. And I think because of the seriousness of the crimes that are alleged here, we do owe it to both the victims and the accused to wait for the facts to come out completely and for Kitna to have his day in court, right? I mean, that's his right as an American, and certainly we should support that. From a societal perspective, obviously pornography and child pornography are becoming more and more prevalent. They're more and more available. So I think that does mean that you got to be fully in favor of draconian policies to try to stamp this kind of thing out. And I'm glad Kitna was caught and arrested if the allegations turn out to be true. And, a conviction should certainly bring significant life-altering punishment. Again, with a conviction. But so what do you do in a circumstance like this? I mean, you can't really do anything that's all that helpful. I think you pray, certainly, specifically for the victims of the crime. The victim isn't Kitna's career. It's not U.S. quarterback position. The victim is someone underage who is exploited for a cheap thrill or a laugh or even worse. And that kind of hurt doesn't go away. It can't be made okay. And so lives have been altered in a really decidedly negative way because of Kitna's actions. And the victims have to live with that reality. And so, it's just a terrible thing. And I do think it's a distant second priority, but I also think we should pray for Kitna too. I don't have any idea what's led him down this specific path. If the allegations are true, his life deservedly is never going to be the same. But it doesn't have to be a waste. And so that doesn't mean you let him back on the field or you paper over what he's done, but it does mean, you have to acknowledge that humans are broken and some of us are broken more than others. That being said, though, the only reason we're paying attention to this is because Kitna is U.S. backup quarterback. If this was a random Florida student, this wouldn't be a story, and we certainly wouldn't be addressing it here on the podcast. But I think it is a good reminder that child exploitation and human trafficking isn't just something that's happening in a foreign country. It happens right here at home. And so if you do want to help out, Tim Tebow has an organization that's dedicated to addressing human trafficking. And so if you feel moved to do something, I think maybe that might be a place to start. But it's a sad day for everyone, but none more than for the victim or the victims. And I think we should keep our attention there and not on football.
The University Athletic Association released the following statement regarding Kitna. We are shocked and saddened to hear of the news involving Jalen Kitna. These are extremely serious charges, and the University of Florida and the UAA have zero tolerance for such behavior. Jalen has been suspended indefinitely. Will, it's like you said, if any, if there's truth to these charges, and like you said, he's got to stay in court ahead of them. But if there's truth to these charges, fully expect that will be the last we've seen of Jalen Kitna suiting up for the Florida Gators. So sad day in Gainesville, sad news. Like you said, if there's truth to the charges, that's great work by the police, great work by the organizations tracking that stuff down.
Yeah, I think Florida is such a distant thought in all of this, and I think the big thing is that if these things are true, then you hope that there are things in place to rehabilitate Kitna, but also to help the victims, and because that's really where my heart and where my thoughts are at this point.
Yep. Well, obviously a very difficult story, and seems pretty light in comparison to transition. We're going to go into 4 bits here, and we're going to talk about the Florida State game. Will, roller coaster performance for the Gators that really I felt like it represented much of the 2022 season in a nutshell. 45-38 to FSU and ends up in a loss. Richardson goes 9 of 27, 198 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. ETN 17 carries, 129 yards. Johnson same amount of carries, 85 yards. Each of them had a TD. Richardson 10 carries for 41 yards. Ricky Pearsall really the star on the day offensively, 5 receptions, 148 yards, 2 touchdowns, and the offense really they brought it. There was a stretch there in the second half where you really wish they would have run the ball. I think Trevor's brother, Travis Etienne, made that pretty clear on Twitter at one point. Run the ball. He was saying everything that every Gator fan was saying. And defensively, Will, back to what we've seen for a lot of the year here. Just shy of the 500-yard mark for Florida State. Jordan Travis played an absolutely great game. He was tough to stop. 15 rushes, 83 yards, including 2 epic scrambles around the goal line. That was 2 unbelievable runs there. But he was 13 for 30, not super accurate on the day. 270 yards and a touchdown. So when he completed it, he made it count. Benson was a problem on the ground. 20 rushes, 111 yards and a touchdown. Will, typical performance for this team, just up and down. But they did fight. They showed some fight in there, and they kept it close at the end.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the mistakes that we saw in the Vanderbilt game popped up again. You had, a late hit out of bounds on a punt return that set them up, set Florida State up for the touchdown that put them up by 2 touchdowns. You had another illegal formation on a running play that was it was a touchdown that got called back because of illegal formation. Florida got bailed out by that on a pass interference penalty on a couple of plays later on Ricky Pearsall. Anthony Richardson looked otherworldly in the first half, only had 10 attempts at 151 yards passing, and he was 5 of 7 for 151 at one point in there for 3 touchdowns. And you just sit there going, holy moly, like we got good Anthony Richardson today. We got a shot. You're up 24-21 going into the half, feeling like, hey, like this is like, were there some opportunities that were missed in the first half? Sure, but we're still ahead. You got the ball coming out in the second half, and then you get the 3 straight 3-and-outs. Richardson can't complete a ball to save his life. Doesn't complete a ball in the third quarter at all. Doesn't complete a ball until like the last drive in the fourth quarter. And even then it was sort of a comedy of errors in terms of the holding penalties and the block in the back and all that sort of stuff. Some missed calls by the officials there on that last drive, but that's not why Florida lost the game. Florida lost the game because they gave up 45 points. And we can point to Richardson being bad in the second half. We can point to the 3 straight 3-and-outs. We can point to Billy Napier not going to the running game and those sorts of things and say, hey, maybe those had an impact on whether Florida won the game. But the reality is that Florida did not put its defense in a terrible situation all night long. Like it wasn't like they turned it over at their own 20 repeatedly. They did it once. And, but just like it has been all year, Florida State was able to cash in on the opportunities they had, and the opportunities that Florida State gave Florida, they weren't necessarily able to cash in on. And so you lose by a touchdown, which has sort of been the story all year. They're 3-3 in 1-score games. couple of games that were 10 points when they were really kind of one score games the whole way through. When you think about Kentucky and who else did they lose by 10 to? So there was another game in there that was close to. It's been close
I
games
think
all
we
year.
lost
They
by
have
10 to LSU, didn't we?
yeah. So a lot of close games haven't been able to get over the hump, and the same general story, which is the defense couldn't stop anybody. Florida State 9 of 16 on third down. You have the just backbreaking conversions by Travis when they essentially had him stop for field goals, and Travis broke free and turned those two drives into touchdowns. And if they get 6 points instead of 14 on those two drives, Florida's right in this game, and probably that ETN run wins it and puts Florida up by 8 or 9 points, rather than it being a tying game. Now, they did come back, right? I mean, they came back and tied the game. They brought to 38-38. That's something we haven't seen all year. And then immediately had a third and 13 or something like that on the next drive, and a back shoulder throw from Travis to Johnny Wilson, and Florida State was off. And from that point, it was like a knife through hot butter. And and I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it, but the clock management on the last drive was just awful. I mean, they went from like 4 minutes to a minute left and had gained like 3 yards, even though there were three penalties, the pass interference, and all that stuff. Like the clock's supposed to stop on those. How'd they blow so much time?
Let's talk about those penalties too, though, because you had the crucial fourth down penalty that kept the drive alive, which Florida State fans were going crazy about. Which personally, I thought they missed a call on third down with Pearsall. I think the defensive back was all over Pearsall on third down. That might have been a little bit of a makeup call there on fourth down.
He grabbed his arm.
Yeah. So let's talk about the face mask though. That's pretty clear missed face mask there, Will.
Yeah, I mean that SEC officials. There's going to be I don't know if they do this in the NCAAs. They do it in the NFL, right? They apologize and basically say, "Oh, yeah, we missed that one," and they're going to definitely have to do that after this one. Look, the game should have moved on, absolutely, but you had multiple opportunities, and
Yeah.
the idea that face mask cost them.
I don't think it cost them the game. I think it's what you said, that clock management on that final drive. But do you think part of that and maybe slow rolling that drive had to do with the fact that Napier had no interest in giving it back to his defense?
Maybe, but I think you want to slow play it at least when you get across midfield.
Right. Don't slow play it from the 25.
The problem is, and I'd have to go back and actually look at the box score, but my recollection is that even if they'd gotten the face mask penalty, they would have then been hard pressed to get off 4 more plays to take shots at the end zone, which means you mismanage the clock. Because if you aren't going to be able to get 4 plays off with that face mask, then, what were you going to do if you got a first down on that fourth down? You weren't going to be able to run 4 straight plays. He had already mismanaged the timeout situation where they only had 11 guys on the field to start with, or they had 10 guys on the field on a fourth down. And so they had to call a timeout, and then they called a timeout on a delay of game on the previous drive, or would have been a delay game on the previous drive. You can't waste timeouts like that and expect to win. In Florida, again, it's just error after error after error, which is essentially what's happened all year long. So, look, I think there's a lot of good that you can look at and say this team isn't that far away. And if you're Florida State, I'd be really worried, because this is the worst Florida team they're going to face over the next 4 or 5 years. And the team took them right to the brink. And I'd be worried if I was a Noel fan, because of that specifically. It's not going to fly. So actually the 4th and 12 was with 39 seconds left. So if they'd have gotten the face mask, they would have had 35 seconds left from
But to your point though,
13.
Will, not exactly the smartest strategy to lean on your quarterback who's tossing the ball around at about a 1/3 percentage completion rate there.
Well, that's
so
the
you
thing,
maybe
right?
want to leave enough time where you run the ball a little bit.
Well, that's the thing.
That's the strength of your offense.
With 4 minutes, you have the opportunity to run the ball.
Right.
And by the time they got to essentially that first down, I mean, so they took over the ball with 4 minutes left. And by the time they got the pass interference penalty, there was a $1:34 left on the clock. So they wasted 3 minutes, or 2.5 minutes on 4 downs essentially. And that there was a lot of, he completes the ball to Pearsall and there's a block in the back, and they just let the clock keep running because the clock was live even after that block in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Montreal Johnson runs for 3 yards, then Johnson runs for no gains. They did try to run it a little bit to start with. And then Richardson comes out there and rushes for 23 and it gets called back. So, hey, if Richardson hits that 23-yard run, it doesn't get called back for the holding. Now you're at midfield with 2 minutes left and no one's complaining about it. But the fact that you have that holding, again, the clock's running, you come back, the next snap happens with 1:40 left. Richardson throws an incomplete pass and then gets to the pass interference, and you're down to $1.34. So, look, I think if we look at the season as a whole, Billy Napier has some growing to do when it comes to clock management and game management overall. I have not been overly impressed with the way he's done that all year long. I think he did the right things in the Tennessee game. Other than that, I have not necessarily seen fantastic clock management either at the end of the half or the end of the games all year long. Now, again, he has been limited at the quarterback position in some capacity there, just because it does not feel like they have a hurry up version of this offense. And, with 4 minutes left, he said, I'm going to run my normal offense. And I think that's a mistake. But again, if your guy isn't equipped to run the hurry up and hasn't been all year, do you pull it out in that game, or do you just say, I got 4 minutes, I'm going to be as methodical as I can?
Did you feel like I felt like he was setting up for a 4-minute drive and go for two?
There was no doubt he was going for 2 points.
Yeah, that's
zero.
It just
doubt.
felt like I'm not putting this back in the hands of my defense at all. Like we are going to win this game on this drive, or it's not going to happen.
Well, and that's a fundamental flaw with Florida this year, and I'm hoping, I don't know whether it's the case, but I'm hoping that's going to be the problem that crops up, or I'm hoping that'll be the solution to the Napier clock management issues. I think he has an idea of what he wants to do in an ideal scenario. And I don't think he was able to do that this year because of the defense. And I think he was inconsistent. I do think that was
an impact. Absolutely.
And I think he was inconsistent at times in terms of what his normal convictions would be because he couldn't trust what was going to happen on that side of the ball. And I hope that fixes a lot of the things that we've sort of struggled with, where, with 1.5 minutes, you're not going to try to go down the field at the end of the first half because you might give it back to Tennessee with 30 seconds left. And hey, our defense can give up a touchdown in 30 seconds. We've done it before. And so that does impact the aggressiveness. And then when you're aggressive, it backfires, right? I mean, he calls the timeout against Tennessee on 3rd down and 10. They had Brenton Cox blitzing up the middle. Cox doesn't get home. They convert it. And all of a sudden they score a touchdown in the half. And you would have been going into the half ahead. Instead, you're going ahead. I think they were behind by 3 to Tennessee at that point.
Yeah. That's a great point. That's a great example right there of Billy showing confidence in the defense early on in the season, and then maybe learning his lesson down the stretch.
But at the same point, like, Billy Napier's responsible for that defense at the end of the day. And so, hey, you don't have confidence in that defense. Well,
but part of coaching is just acknowledging what what your team is. Acknowledging that, like, hey, yeah, I know this defense isn't good. I'm going to strategize and call a game around it a little bit. That makes sense.
Well, so now you're getting to my soapbox. What did I text you after the first defensive play?
Oh, you went back about 5 nights on me here. What did you text me?
I said they're playing single high safety and blitzing. Right. This is bad. And that's all they did on 3rd down all night long. They had one 3rd down, or no, they had one money down. So it was a 4th down where they played a zone. And that was the one where Trey Dean almost got the pick 6. And they never went back to it. And Jordan Travis showed on film against Wake Forest that if you sit back in a zone shell, he will try to force it in. You're going to get turnovers, and he's not accurate enough to take advantage of it. Now, you do that against Hendon Hooker, you're going to get absolutely obliterated. But you do it against Jordan Travis, you have an opportunity. And what happens is then when you have a blitz, if you don't get home, all your defenders are in man-to-man coverage. So they're not looking back at the quarterback. And so he's got a free run wherever he wants to go. So the little dumps over the middle to the running back where the running back was on the linebacker and was wide open, or the linebacker actually went in the wrong spot and was wide open across the middle. That's a function of the defense Florida was playing. The fact that Jordan Travis was able to escape 4 guys when it looked like they were going to get home. Okay, that's on the guys. The blitz got home on that one. But there were 3 other times where the blitz didn't get home. Travis just got to the outside, ran, and either made a first down or essentially set up Florida State for a touchdown. And so they never made an adjustment from that. And the thing that worries me is that the film that I looked at before the game said blitzing on 3rd down is the wrong approach to stop Jordan Travis. And they just never stopped. And at the end of the day, 9-16. Now, you could sit there and say, well, we're going to get destroyed in zone too. We've gotten destroyed when we played zone all year long. That may be true, but it's still, if the art of coaching is taking the reality of your team. It also means taking the reality of the other one. And Wake Forest had a crappy defense this year, and they were able to stop Florida State and win that game against Florida State by playing a boatload of zone. And I'm okay if you want to play some blitzing, some single high safety sometimes. But they basically said, we're going to man up and we think we can beat you. And they gave up 45 points. So I point straight at Patrick Toney and in some ways Billy Napier there, because it's like from the start, that was the wrong thing to do. And that's worrying. That's worrying to me. We're going to play our scheme no matter what. I don't think that's the right way to play football. I think you have to adjust to what your offensive opponent is going to do. And I didn't think they did that very well in this one.
Yeah, I was pretty fired up when we came out and forced a turnover on the first drive. I thought, all right, there we go.
On a 29-yard third down conversion.
Yeah, nobody completes a 29-yard pass on our defense without paying a price this year, Will. That's all we can say about the 2022 Gators defense. You're going to pay a price for that 29-yard completion on us. Hey, obviously a lot of work to do with this team sitting at 6-6. Let me ask you something. How does this year's 6-6 feel to you versus last year's 6-6? And I know 6 losses. Nobody's happy with that, but let's go into the weeds a little bit, have a little nuance with it, because to me, I think it's night and day difference in the season in terms of, yeah, you had some of your bad losses or whatever, but I do think that this team, this is a lot different 6-6 story than we watched in 2021.
In what way?
In what way? Last year, we're coming down. I think last year that team for a stretch, there was that stretch where they totally checked out. They totally checked that South Carolina game. I did not feel, hey, look, that Vanderbilt game was not a good game, but I didn't feel like the team was checked out. They might have not prepped well that week. There's talk around that. They made a lot of mistakes. I think this team had a lot of deficiencies. After the USF game, after watching that game, I watched that defense week in and week out with not heavy expectation of much, because you saw that what they were capable of on the good side and the bad side at times, where they'd have a nice drive and then they would completely go back to what they were doing before. There was no consistency drive to drive. There's no consistency game to game with the defense. So the defense was a struggle year in and year out, or throughout the entire season here. But I do think overall, you look at the games. Tennessee, we're on the 30-yard line, taking a shot into the end zone to win the game in a game that we really had no business being in. Your LSU, if you're not getting that the penalty on Dexter, we got an interception with the chance to go down the ball and go tie the game with the ball. Vanderbilt, it was a horrible shot to the end zone to tie the game, but you're on the 30 taking a shot. And FSU, you're about on the 30 taking a shot. So 4 of those losses, you're in the game. Georgia, you weren't really in the game, and Kentucky pulled away late on that. But for those losses, like, you're fighting, you're scrapping. And so when Billy Napier gets up there and coach speaks about this team having fight, I don't think that's total BS. I think they did show fight. I think it was a team with a lot of limitations, though. And I think they did what they could with what they had. Whereas last year, I feel like the team totally dipped out that second part of the season.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it sort of depends on how you evaluate the team. I thought last year's team was better. I think especially if you look early in the year, they beat the crap out of FAU and USF. Then they should have beaten Alabama, quite honestly. They beat Tennessee. The Kentucky game, they actually had a 60% post-game win percentage. That's one they probably should have gotten. Mm-hmm. They had a 100% win percentage over Vanderbilt, and they got whipped by LSU. So by all intents and purposes, Florida should have been 5-2 or 6-1 last year in the first half of the year. And that didn't happen. They wound up 4-3 because they lost a bunch of one-score games. The Gator team last year went 1-4 in one-score games, though Dan Mullen went 0-4. It was the Florida State game that was the one win in that category. Some of that is because they checked out, and certainly by the end of the year they had. And the problem with last year's team is there was no hope that there was going to be any sort of improvement, because why would we see improvement? They'll just run back Grantham and Hevesy again, and we'll be back to having Anthony Richardson on the bench with Emory Jones playing and those sorts of things. So I get why you would say that, but this team is not good. I mean, you look at all the statistics last year, and Florida had better overall statistics than the 6-6 record would indicate. And I think would have been a better team had the coach been able to get them to fight as hard as this team did this year. So really it's a question of, do you appreciate the ability to get them to fight, or do you appreciate the ability of them to actually play the game? I think last year's team was better from a playing the game perspective. I think this year's team showed more fight. And, that's a testament to Napier and a denigration to Dan Mullen. At the same time, like, you should fight for your brand new coach the first year he's in there. And so the question is going to be, is that fight still going to be there 3 years from now when there are other guys in there? And is Napier going to be able to raise the level enough to get there? I'm never going to say a loss to Vanderbilt's acceptable. I'm
Never.
never going to say
Nope.
6-6 is acceptable. I just don't think it is. Now, look, if you win the bowl game, you're 7-6. It's a better record than last year, but I don't think this team is better than it was last year. And so if you're asking about progress, if you're asking about moving forward, I don't see a lot of football progress on this team yet. Now, maybe there are reasons for that, and maybe we'll see a big jump next year. But here's what I said after Napier's first recruiting class is I said, he had an opportunity to prove to people that he was going to be an elite recruiter by bringing in Jacoby Matthews, who wound up going to Texas A&M, or Harold Perkins, who wound up going to LSU. And if he'd brought in those guys and been able to close those guys on National Signing Day, then you say, okay, like, there's a new sheriff in town and this guy is an elite recruiter. And him missing on those guys didn't mean he wasn't an elite recruiter, but what it meant is that he hadn't answered the question as to whether he was an elite recruiter. And I think 6-6 this year with a bad loss to Vanderbilt, some of the discipline penalties towards the end of the year that started to crop up, some of the mismanagement of the clock, the last four of the first half, the first four of the second half. I think there are a lot of questions about Billy Napier, and I wasn't expecting to have questions about on the field for a guy who spent 4 years at Louisiana coaching. I expected that to be tight, and then there was going to be the recruiting on the back end. So, look, I'm not saying that Napier needs to go. I'm not saying that I think he can't be successful, but I'm saying there are still questions, and there are still questions on the recruiting trail. There are still questions in terms of his on-field ability to coach. And there are going to be questions about the program in general and the discipline of the program, depending upon how things develop before the bowl game and then into next year. And, we'll see. I think there's absolutely an opportunity that Napier could answer all of those questions in the affirmative, but I leave this season less sure about what Florida's got in Billy Napier than I did going into it. And that, to me, is sort of the discouraging part of the overall season.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples out there of coaches who have struggled in their first year, who have been able to go turn around pretty quickly, right? We've seen that all across college football before. And I gotta say, you're as discouraging as aspects of this season were. If you were to focus on some of the brighter spots, you look at some of the players that were identified by Napier and brought in, they were some of our better players this year, right? In some cases, particularly you look at that running back room, man, Johnson, ETN, those guys were fantastic this year. But yeah, there's plenty to question. Everything you said was fair. Plenty of examples when you talk about the clock management. It's not just one game. You can point at several games, and I felt like almost every game there was at least a question surrounding halftime or end of game clock management, right? So there's plenty of examples of aspects to improve about this team going forward. But I also think you need to take a reality check. And for me, that reality check, I after that USF game, man, just seeing, okay, we're not quite we got a little work to do here. We got a little work to do in building this roster. It's going to take a little bit. It's going to take more time than I wanted it to, and then I thought it could. I thought that we could have a little bit of a cheat code with Napier coming in, bringing in some of these young guys, and I thought that maybe with Richardson he would be a little further along than what he was this year. And I thought that might have been a little inspiration for us, particularly after you start the season. Utah's playing in the Pac-12 championship, y'all. They're playing USC. USC's only loss, who's a playoff team, is Utah right now. And they're going for another shot at taking down USC to impact the college football playoff race here. And we're one of Utah's losses on the season. So particularly when we open with that, I was highly encouraged that maybe we had a little cheat code and we are going to jump to that 8-9 win season right out the gate with Billy. But man, oh man, you saw this team kind of just like you always said, that variance, right? It was just all over the place. Never quite could figure that out throughout the season. And quite frankly, it's just going to take time to rebuild this roster, and more time than I think most of us would like to admit.
Yeah, well, I mean, the cheat code was going to be Anthony Richardson, right?
Yeah.
I mean, coming into the year, you're like, if Richardson plays well, if he plays If he plays good, Florida's going to be good. If he plays elite, Florida will be borderline elite. If he plays poor, if he plays average, Florida will be average. And if he plays poorly, Florida will be poor. And he played average. He was decidedly average when you look at a lot of ups and a lot of downs. But overall, when you average everything together, he wound up being about an average quarterback. And and that's even with including the running and being generous. He was below average when you look at it through the air. And so, look, 6-6 seems right based on that. And I agree with you actually from the standpoint of a lot of people have pointed out, obviously Saban has a 21-14 loss to Louisiana Monroe in his first year, and he turns it around the next year. In fact, I think they had like 7 blowout wins the next year, and they're in the SEC championship game losing to Urban Meyer.
Can I jump in real quick on that, Will?
Yeah, sure.
How many coaches have a shitty win in their first year or bad loss in their first year?
Well,
and
so
just have a terrible track record after that. But we always use Saban and Louisiana Monroe as the prime example of, it's okay. How many coaches have terrible losses in their first year?
You stole my thunder because Mike Shula, the guy before Saban, had a 19-16 loss to Northern Illinois, and he turned out great. Ed Orgeron, though, no one talks about Coach O. 24-21 loss to Troy.
Yeah.
And then you got Kirby, obviously, the loss to Vanderbilt, though Vanderbilt was actually a better team. Their worst loss was they had a 45-14 loss to 5-7 Ole Miss. Butch Jones had a 14-10 loss to Vanderbilt. Gary Pinkel, 20-13 to Bowling Green. Hugh Freeze lost 27-26 to Vandy.
Auburn head coach Hugh Freeze.
Mike Sherman lost to Arkansas State. Rich Brooks lost to Vandy when he was at Kentucky. Jim Donnan at Georgia lost to Southern Miss. You got a Brett Bielema when he was at Arkansas, lost to 6-7 Rutgers. That turned out to be a harbinger for things to come. Chad Morris lost to North Texas. He really turned that around at Arkansas. Barry Odom lost to Middle Tennessee State. Derek Mason lost to Temple. And Clark Lee at Vanderbilt lost to East Tennessee State last year. So yeah, the point is there have been a lot of SEC coaches. That's the last 3 coaches at every school that I went and tracked. 16 coaches had a bad loss in their first season. 3 guys wound up winning the SEC championship with a bad loss. 4 won the SEC championship without. So that's Les Miles, Gene Chizik, Gus Malzahn, and Mark Richt. And so basically a loss to Vanderbilt doesn't portend anything one way or the other. There are examples of guys who have gone on to do great things. And there are also examples of guys who've crashed and burned. And like I said, the impression that Vanderbilt game specifically gives in my mouth is just, or the taste it leaves in my mouth is just really, really bitter. And it's going to be a long time before I'm able to turn around and go, yeah, Napier, woohoo. It's like, no, they needed to get that one. The fact that they didn't means there are questions. And so I'm going into this off season with questions, and he's not going to be able to answer them until next fall. That's the reality.
I feel almost as bad about the USF win as I do the Vanderbilt loss too. So not all the wins were even pretty here, but Will, I have a buddy who's a Miami fan, and he was asking, because he was texting we were texting during the Pitt game the other night where they were down 28-3 at one point, I believe in front of I don't know, a strong 4,000 folks in front of at the Hard Rock Stadium down there in Miami on Saturday night.
They didn't even have a bus of students.
Right. Heard that too. They didn't, but there no students signed up. It was Thanksgiving break, and they didn't even have buses for students to go up to the game. As bad as Napier's season was at Florida, and granted, hey, we're our own program. What's going on at Miami doesn't impact us. Like we got to focus on ourselves, right? But he asked the question. He said, "Has a first season been this bad?" Because you look at that offense. The thing that Mario really did not do down there, that Napier did accomplish here. You come away from this team going like, "What's one thing Billy did well this year?" Will,
what was one thing Billy did well this year?
Yeah. Well, what's one thing the team did well this year?
They fought.
We're pretty off. Like specifically, I think the running game, for example, was really good. I think you walk away with a little bit of identity. The offensive line play was good. The running game was excellent, and you can walk away with a little bit of identity. You have no identity on defense. You didn't do anything to move the needle there. But what identity does Miami have right now? They didn't even establish that. He said, as bad as his season was, like, what hope do we have after that first season? I looked up coaches too, Will. I have my own list here. Willie Taggart was 2-10 at USF. Turn it around at USF. Kirby 8-5. Saban was the 7-6. Lance Leopold 2-10 at Kansas. Jim Tressel was 7-5 at Ohio State. Barry Alvarez at Wisconsin 1-10, 5-6, 5-6, 3 years before a 10-1-1 season. Bob Stoops was 7-5 at Oklahoma. Butch Davis 5-6 in year 3 of his tenure at Miami, and Howard Schnellenberger down at Miami, opened his career 5-6 for the Hurricanes. So the first year tends to not define an era inside of a program, but it might show you some things that you're going to do well going forward, and maybe some things you'll struggle with going forward. And honestly, a lot to be written in the history of Billy Napier in Gators football so far. Will.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Miami example is actually a great one. That's one where I actually picked Oregon in our preseason magazine to make it to the playoff, and you were laughing at me, but Oregon was way better than they were last year, even with Bo Nix at quarterback. And
especially with Bo Nix at quarterback, you can say.
Well, but I think in many ways he was also one of the reasons why they didn't make the playoff. But the reason that I did that is because I looked at Cristobal's track record and said teams are better before he gets there and better after he leaves. And you can sort of see that in his history, but he's a heck of a recruiter. So, what the hope that I would have if I was a Miami fan is, hey, we got Ron Zook. Like, we got a guy who's going to fill the cupboards for when the next guy comes in. We're hoping that Billy Napier is more than that, but obviously he's got to contend with Cristobal on the recruiting trail, and he's going to have to improve on the field, and he has the opportunity to do that. This was a learning experience for him, just like anybody else. I mean, you sit there and you talk about SEC speed, and the only guy I've ever seen who I mean, Osiris Torrance this year came in and didn't miss a beat. Montreal Johnson was good, but still, like, his first drive of the year has a fumble. Like, it takes you a little while to get used to the fact that this is speed, and it's speed every week. And I think in some ways that's the difference between the Louisiana teams and the Florida teams, is that Napier, I think, learned, and especially learned for that Vanderbilt game, there are no weeks off. There is nothing. Like, you play the dregs of the Sun Belt, and it's going to be an easy win. You play the bottom team in the SEC, especially with what Lee and Barton Simmons and those folks are built in there. Hey, you're going to get punched in the mouth. And, hopefully that's a learning experience for him, because the SEC is different. And yes, we have been mired in the SEC for years and years and years. Certainly he was at Alabama for a little while, so he kind of knows what that's like, except Alabama in the years he was there literally could roll the ball out there against just about half the SEC and beat them by 30. So I'm not sure you learned that lesson there. Right? I'm not sure you learned the lesson of having to take everybody seriously. And, I think in many ways they game plan. They had some new stuff in the Florida State game in the offense. That little pitch that they ran on fourth down that nobody liked, they ran it a couple of times. That's a new wrinkle to, in many ways, I think, try to open up the running game in a different way. And, so they added a few things, and to have them adding things in that 12th game there, considering they haven't really added anything all year long, does in some way make me think that they were already looking forward to Florida State during that Vanderbilt game. And that's a lesson to be learned. So look, I think, would I rather have Napier or Cristobal? I'd rather have Napier. The question you're going to have to ask me is, would I rather have Napier or Hugh Freeze? And I think there are other, moral issues that you got to contend with if you're going to bring in a guy like Freeze.
No, you don't, because he's not allowed to use social media according to his contract. So there's no chance. If you just ban him from a university cell phone, I think you got every angle covered, dude.
Well, irrespective of that, I think there are obviously legitimate reasons why Hugh Freeze isn't the Florida head coach. But look, you're gonna have to compete with him now. And he's a heck of a recruiter too. And the SEC is not getting any easier. So, Napier's got a lot of stuff to prove, just like this team has a lot to prove. That's okay. But I think it's okay to also say that's disappointing, that you would have hoped to have seen more proved throughout the 2022 season.
Hugh Freeze and Auburn, they're just perfect for each other. They deserve each other.
I'm looking forward to the booster stabbing him in the back 3 years from now.
It'll happen. It'll happen.
Oh, yeah.
It's a matter of time. It's a match made in heaven. Can't wait to watch that.
The minute Urban decides he wants to come out of retirement, that'll be.
Oh boy. All right, let's move on here. 6 bits. Let's talk about the transfer portal, Will. And obviously, there's a lot of names that are going to be filing in here. But I did a little digging. I went there on position by position on the. First off, let's first identify which positions that we both agree that the Gators are 100% going to need portal help. But I'll tell you what, I dug through the 24/7 listing of the transfer portal right now, and they're fairly up to date. They keep up with it pretty well. It might take it might not. Guys are kind of flooding in right now, so I'm sure they don't have every single name in there. But of the names in there, for those of you who think we're just going to fix this roster with plug and play guys from the portal, I don't know if those guys are as prevalent as fans tend to think in their minds. Like, oh, well, we'll just go to the portal. Let's go to the portal. You hear that a lot. I saw that Kenny Dillingham got hired out of Arizona State. I'm just hearing a lot of, oh, well, yeah, they got a lot of, they'll plug in some holes on the portal and everything. You just think, yeah, yeah, that's not as easy as it looks, especially if you want to build a quality program in the SEC here in Florida. If you're looking to get quality guys in, that's going to be there's not a ton of quality guys just floating around out there in the perfect positions of need. But Will, let's first focus on the positions of need for this team.
Okay, I think quarterback.
Number one right now, right?
Absolutely.
Number one.
I actually think that's true whether Richardson stays or leaves. If Richardson stays, you can't have a guy with a QB rating of 120 over the course of the year who at times can't hit the broadside of the barn. Right. Now, he obviously is an extraordinarily dynamic playmaker and had times where you looked at it and said, oh my God, this is unbelievable. But you also had times where you're like, oh my God, 10 straight incompletions. Like, what's going on? And that level of inconsistency shouldn't be enough to win the job at Florida. And so, look, I think it's perfectly legitimate to go out and get somebody to compete with him if he stays. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to, obviously, you're going to have to go out and get somebody if he decides to leave, unless you feel like you have a star in Max Brown or Jack Miller.
What about, I was going to say, Jack Miller got lost in the shuffle this year with that injury.
Or Jaden Rashada. But, yeah. But again, I think from the standpoint of a numbers perspective, you're going to need a quarterback anyway. And so if you can go get somebody now, I think you end up with a better player if he doesn't have to compete with Anthony Richardson. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think having somebody to compete with Richardson is going to be important.
So there have been rumors, and I saw an article today about the Hartman, right? The quarterback out Wake is looking at the portal potentially. Like I've seen heard rumors of other names, but these are the names that are actually in the portal right now. Connor Bazelak, for some of you fans here, you might remember him from Missouri, but he was at Indiana this past year. Paul Tyson from Arizona State is in the portal. Luke Altmaier from Ole Miss. If you watched some of that Sugar Bowl last year, you saw him. Cade McNamara, the Michigan quarterback last year, who lost his job to J.J. McCarthy at the beginning of this year. Jeff Sims from Georgia Tech, and Hank Bachmeier from Boise State. Will, you totally transforming the program with any of those names?
No, and I think that's kind of the story of the portal in general. Now, I think everybody expects it's going to be crazy, but I also think that the recognition of NIL and the inflation associated with NIL and the fact that most of the guys who are transferring at this point, when they committed, did not have NIL available. Mm-hmm. And so, the idea that you're going to be able to go get somebody cheaply, quote unquote, in the transfer portal, I think is, if they're any good, there's going to be a price associated with it through NIL and those sorts of things. And so you're going to have to decide, am I going to allocate resources to guys in the portal, or am I going to allocate resources to guys who are high school recruits? And there are resource limitations at every school. And so it's a zero-sum game. If you put money towards the portal, then you're not putting it towards high school. And so I think in many ways, if you want Napier to succeed long-term, you don't want him bringing in 13 guys from the transfer portal. I think that's a problem, because I think then it means that you're under-allocating your resources towards high school recruiting. So look, if you have an opportunity, if Anthony Richardson, let's say Anthony Richardson decides to declare for the draft, mm-hmm. and you have an opportunity to bring in a guy like Hartman, or, somebody else who decides to transfer, who's been an elite quarterback somewhere, even Rising out of Utah, or Grayson McCall at Coastal Carolina, or anybody else who's already been good. Right. And you have an opportunity to bring them in. Well, I don't know whether they're looking to leave, but you look at like Michael Penix, who left Indiana, right? Goes out to Washington and just lights things up. Bo Nix,
Heisman level campaign for those of you who don't follow Pac-12 football. He's a Heisman level performer this year, Michael Penix.
Bo Nix, he
Yeah.
leaves and he goes to Oregon. You know, Dylan Gabriel left UCF and played pretty well for Oklahoma, even though Oklahoma wasn't any good. So those sorts of guys, Hendon Hooker was somebody who was in the transfer portal a couple years
Right.
ago, ends up at Tennessee. Those guys exist. They're game changing guys who exist. And
Baker,
if
Kyler.
you yeah, well, and so if you can get somebody like that, then great. But I don't think you should just willy nilly go out in the transfer portal, and like the transfer portal should be used for depth
Yeah.
in order to basically insure yourself against injury. I think that's my opinion. My opinion is unless you have somebody who puts you over the top to win the conference or a national title, I don't think it's worth it. I think you invest in high school recruiting.
Yeah. And so for Florida's example, a guy like Altmaier, McNamara, or Sims might make a lot of sense just for you bring them in to compete potentially, but for depth especially. So I
Like
like
Hudson Card, didn't he enter the portal from Texas? And you know, they're going to be there's going to be a bunch of other guys before December 5th.
that's the
But
thing. Yeah, that's we didn't want to get too specific with names because the names are going to change rapidly here in the
yeah,
next couple of weeks.
I'm just
Yeah,
making stuff up. I don't have inside information about people, but I was trying to say like that level of quarterback, right? Guys who have
right.
had success at places before, and you know those guys. You bring in a guy who's won 10 games at a Power Five level. Yeah, like that's a guy you should bring in, right? Jaden Daniels is a big reason why LSU has won a bunch of games this
Great
year.
example. Yeah,
And so you know him supplementing the rest of what LSU has done. But let's be honest, they beat Arkansas because of Harold Perkins, and so and Jane Daniels didn't play very well in that one, and so LSU is 9-3. It's been a successful season for Brian Kelly. The question is, did he end up missing somebody in the high school recruiting because he brought in Jaden Daniels? And that's going to be the question you have to ask: is
I
if
think he
bringing
would
in
trade that for his SEC West title and the win over Bama. I think he'd trade that right now.
well, but that's actually one of the reasons why I like what Vanderbilt's done,
Yeah,
having somebody who's essentially a director of player procurement or general manager, whatever Barton Simmons is, because you run into this in professional sports all the time, where and this is one of the reasons why the Houston Texans are so terrible right now, is that they had Bill O'Brien as the head coach and they fired the general manager and they made Bill O'Brien the general manager. And Bill O'Brien, the general manager, was making trades to try to, well, in some circles, it seemed like he was trying to make trades to get himself fired. But the point is that the incentives for someone who looks at it and says, I need to build a program are sometimes different than the guy who says, I need to win games right now. And so you need to make sure that those incentives are aligned. And so we'll actually know a little bit, I think, in terms of how Florida participates in the transfer portal. If Florida is bringing in multiple like high name recognition guys into the program, they've decided to invest in the portal in a way that I think is unwise, but we'll see how it works out.
yeah. I'm gonna go next position group here. Will defensive line. The defensive front is going to need some help next year. I'm not seeing any names I'm absolutely crazy about in the portal. I saw a Stanford edge, Stephen Herron, has 5.5 sacks entering the portal. But again, I don't know how much help you're going to find up front. I mean, there's going to be time, there's going to be new names entering it, but it's something that I think we're going to lean heavily on a lot of these young guys coming in next year.
Yeah, well, I actually sort of disagree with that. I mean, I think Dexter is probably going to move on. That would be my guess. I don't know that, but if you look at Chris McClellan, I thought he played really well. I
Played
think Human
well.
Milan
Yeah.
and Powell Ryland are going to be back on the defensive line. I think obviously you got
Well,
Desmond
you want
Watson
that
who's going to be back as
rotation,
well.
right? You gotta
Sure,
get that depth in there.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, but if you look at the recruiting class, you got Kelby Collins, who's the 74th overall
Right.
player. You've got You've got Cameron James, who's ranked 163rd. You got TJ Searcy, who's rated 195th. You've got Will Norman, who's rated 196th. So they've got a bunch of high level recruits who are coming into the program. And McClellan made an impact this year, right? There's no doubt that McClellan made an impact. And those four guys that I named are guys who are all ranked in a similar range as Chris McClellan. So if you've got McClellan, Watson, Human Milan, and Powell Ryland as your starting defensive line. And then you have these younger guys filling in, and two or three of them can give you spot minutes, and one guy turns into not elite, but turns into a very solid contributor. I'm not necessarily all that worried about that position, especially because there are going to probably be a couple of guys who might step up that we haven't seen so far. So that I mean, if you want to bring in somebody as a depth piece, like, a couple years ago when they brought in Valentino and Daquan Newkirk and those sorts of
So
guys.
I don't think Billy would sneeze at a guy that could give him some serious minutes out there too.
Well,
I don't think that's going to be. I would expect to see. I'd like to see a little help up the middle, and if we could bring in one edge rusher, I think that would be pretty nice in the portal.
yeah, Summerall's out there too, and I just I look at the defense and I go, the place that needs help is linebacker.
That was my next position.
Like, if you ask me where they need help, I would say linebacker.
Yeah,
You got Ventrell Miller leaving, you got Amari Burney leaving, you got Shamar James coming back, you got Wingo coming back. Scooby Williams is coming back, though he didn't play very much. Neither did Wingo. Like,
Chief.
you got Chief Borders, you got DeJuan Black, who was dismissed from the program.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just look at it and go, they don't have a lot of numbers, they don't have a lot of experience,
Definitely
and
need help there.
I think they need a talent infusion there too. And the drop off when Ventrell Miller went away was significant, and I think that's something they're going to have to address, and probably is more than a 1 year fix. And given the guys that they have at linebacker in this recruiting class and in the last recruiting class, I think going outside the program there might make a difference.
Tight end, Will, nothing exciting in the portal right now at tight end. There's just nothing exciting. I know that's a position that we did recruit a couple tight ends last year that we didn't really see much of this year. But also wide receiver. I still think I know we got. I'm excited about this wide receiver class that's coming in for the 2023 recruiting class. I think they did a great job recruiting receiver, but maybe one or two veteran pieces to come in. I thought Pearsall was a great addition to the team. Wasn't a week to week impact guy, but definitely a guy that's a threat on the field. And you saw them in certain situations really try to get the ball in his hand. He was the clear cut number one receiver, I thought, for most of the year.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the actual recruiting you need to do. You need to make sure Ricky Pearsall comes back. And if Ricky Pearsall comes back, then that gives you a foundation for what you need to do at the receiver position.
Mm-hmm.
So Xavier Henderson's going to be back as well. Obviously Justin Shorter's gone. Dejon Reynolds just put his name in the transfer portal tonight. Yep. And so, look, there's obviously going to be some turnover there. They will again, I think depth pieces are the thing that I'm looking for there. You bring in the freshmen, you give them an opportunity. Marcus Burke showed a couple of flashes. You had, Chickacao Bowman showed a couple of flashes too. So there's an opportunity there to bolster that unit, but it's not a unit I'm necessarily all that worried about. Tight end was a mess. I mean, it was a great feel good story to have Xanders there at tight end, but that's a problem when you got a guy converting from defensive line to tight end, even if tight end was his position in high school. And, by the time we got to the end where you had Odom making those catches, he looked pretty good in some of those things, but again, not an elite tight end, not Bowers or Washington or Rick Gilbert or any of those guys who are like big time tight ends. And Napier's offense needs one of those. And so, is one of those guys available in the portal? And is he going to be cheap enough to come to Florida? Is he going to be a cheap enough guy that Florida can go out and get him? Those are the questions. I don't know I mean, you think about it when look at your fantasy football team right now. It's basically Jason Kelsey and then everybody else. Or Travis Kelsey, right? And everybody else. I'm in Philly. Sorry, Jason's his brother. But it's Travis Kelsey and everybody else at tight end. And so if you have an opportunity on the fantasy team to get Travis Kelsey, you all of a sudden have like a 9 or 10 point advantage on everybody you're playing because of the tight end that you have. And so those guys are rare. And the question is, are they going to be available? And then if they're available, does Napier's offense and does the pitch that he makes make appeal to them? I mean, that's the place where an elite guy would make a huge difference. Like if they had a guy like Kyle Pitts coming in that particular position, you'd be like, all right, like now I know what the offense is going to be. I know what the identity is going to be. I know where our go-to guy is. But look, I mean, Kyle Pitts is a once in a generation player. And just like we've been asking for who's the next Percy Harvin now for 20 years, we're sort of going to be doing the same thing at tight end as well.
Yeah, there's no other Percy Harvin. That's the sad news we've figured out over the last 20 years. Well,
Andre DeBose.
That just hurts thinking about that. Yeah, and any other position concerns there for the transfer part? I just
kicker.
It's like you said. Well, what about Trace Mack? We didn't really get to see much of him this year.
I don't know. I mean, look, I think Mihalik was inconsistent.
Yeah,
You're missing
I
extra points by 15 yards, things
yeah,
getting yanked to the left.
I agree.
A lot of field goals that were just mucked up, and it wasn't always Mihalik's fault, but certainly an inconsistency there. Um, and I think there's an opportunity to improve. And I think if you have, again, from the standpoint of like, if Florida's just trying to improve around the edges, those places on special teams where they've struggled are places where you can really make a difference. And so a couple of field goals here, a little bit better kickoffs, either higher kickoffs so you get better coverage, or making sure you kick it out of the end zone every time. You can start to win against the margins. In fact, if you look back at Florida's season overall, their starting field position was 5 yards worse than their opponents. So they were already essentially a couple of points behind every team they played, because, from an expected points perspective, the 5 yard difference or 4 yard difference in field position was like, 2 or 3 points in terms of overall differences. And so, those little things around the edges are the things I think you find in the transfer portal. The idea that you're going to find, a Kyler Murray, or that you're going to find Caleb Williams, or those sorts of things, I think is pretty few and far between. Doesn't mean it can't happen. And if the opportunity arises, yeah, you grab it. But I would expect this to be a more build around the edges than it would be go find 3 elite guys to change your team.
Speaking of transfer portal, with Pearsall, was it Johnny Wilson, the receiver for Florida State, that had a nice night there? He's an
Yep.
Arizona State kid last year. So, and I saw Dan Hicken tweet this out. So you're telling me Arizona State had Jaden Daniels and Johnny Wilson and Ricky Pearsall last year? That's pretty solid offense out there in the desert. That's not bad. That's not bad. So Herm Edwards had something good going out there.
Play to win the game.
Yeah, ended up going south quite quickly. All right, let's jump into a dollar here. We're gonna give out the end of the regular season awards for the SEC. Will, since the Georgia and LSU might be playing in Atlanta this weekend, but the rest of the teams have wrapped up their play until the bowl season. So first off, SEC Player of the Year, Will. I think this is a pretty easy choice. I do have a second name written down just to throw it out there. However, I'm gonna kick it over to you and see who you have for the SEC Player of the Year.
I think it's Hendon Hooker. I think when you
By
look
far.
at who played the best, and who, I mean, Hooker was the guy who, if he'd have played better against Tennessee, and if he hadn't have been injured against South Carolina, probably wins the Heisman Trophy, and probably deserving of the Heisman Trophy if he'd have been able to play a little bit better against Georgia. Look, Georgia's defense is a really good defense, shut down a lot of good quarterbacks. But Hooker, from the standpoint of he essentially took that team, put it on his back, and carried it at times. There were times where they were giving up a ton of points, and it didn't matter because Tennessee's offense couldn't be stopped. I mean, heck, the Florida game was like that, right? Where if Tennessee had anybody other than Hendon Hooker at quarterback, Florida might win that game. And the fact that the Gators weren't able to do so was because of Hendon Hooker. And I think you can say that about a lot of the games that Tennessee played this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the clear cut, far and away number one guy. I also, if you wanted to make an argument and make a case, who would have thunk that LSU is winning the SEC West this year with Jaden Daniels, man? Especially after watching the first 3.5 quarters of that Florida State game. Man, I heard a lot from my Florida State buddies about, oh, we beat LSU. We beat LSU. That's a great win. I'm like, yeah, but you also almost had maybe the most dramatic comeback in college football history, thanks to Jaden Daniels catching fire in that game. And after that FSU game, played pretty well through that stretch in October where they ended up beating Florida, they beat Alabama in November, and then of course they end up coming back to earth. It didn't look good against Tennessee, didn't look good against A&M to end the season there. So definitely some downsides to Jaden Daniels' resume, but man, what we talked about impact of transfer players. I don't think many people would have predicted Jaden Daniels in the position that he was this year. This year with LSU, that's a pretty solid season by Daniels.
Yeah, he played pretty well. I don't think it was anywhere close to Hooker's level. And I think, if you put Hooker in the West and they had beaten Alabama and didn't have to play Georgia, they might have won the West too, right? I think from the standpoint of just Tennessee had to play both buzzsaws. and LSU only had to play one, and I do think that makes a difference. You got to win it, right, when you play the buzzsaw. But this year, Alabama happened to be worse than Georgia, and that proved out in terms of their inability to beat Tennessee, and then their inability to beat LSU as well. I think honorable mention, and this is just because I think he should be rewarded for last season as well, is Will Anderson at Alabama. He had 10 sacks, 51 tackles this year. Had 101 tackles and 17 and a half sacks last year, but that's not 2 years in a row that the guys led the SEC in sacks. And so, I think that's something that we should at least call out in terms of how good of a player he is, because Will Anderson should probably be the first pick in the draft unless there's a quarterback who, everybody decides to go ahead and take.
I think one of my favorite drives the entire season in all college football that I watched was that Texas A&M drive against Alabama, going down the field to try to win the game. The amount of pressure Anderson, particular, that whole Alabama defensive front was insane, but Anderson in particular was just a monster on that drive. So if you want to watch some Will Anderson highlight tape, check out that last drive against Texas A&M. It was incredible. SEC Coach of the Year here, Will. I think there's two obvious front runners here again. I'm going to go. My number one vote would be Josh Heupel in Tennessee. Clearly, completely exceeding expectations with that season they put together. I know it was a disappointing finish against South Carolina there. Obviously, Hooker going out with the injury, that sucked too for them. But man, you beat Florida, you beat Alabama at home. You really took that program to a level they haven't been in a long time. And that, I think you'd also make a case for your boy Bayou Brian there, Will. I think you make a strong case for him too, but I would give it to Heupel.
I'd give it to Kirby Smart.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have his name written down, but that's just a boring pick, man.
It is a boring pick, but his team is by far and away the best team in the SEC. They're incredibly disciplined. The only game they weren't was against Missouri, and they managed to escape that one. No other game has really been close. And unfortunately, I think he's about to finish off a second straight national championship, and we aren't going. I don't think we're going to be able to call him SEC runner-ups anymore either. So it's my nightmare. But look, I've picked at him when he has when he's made stupid choices that's cost his team games. I'm certainly hoping that he'll do it again, but I'm also hoping that this is sort of a reverse jinx too, right? That, hey, Kirby Smart is the SEC Coach of the Year. He's earned my respect. Now go gack one up in the playoff once you get there.
Sorry if you caught me staring off into the distance, just not looking forward to my future of potentially watching a Georgia versus Michigan national championship game. Biggest surprise in the SEC this year, Will? What's your biggest surprise?
South Carolina.
The finish,
right? the finish, the way they finished, and not only how good they were the last 2 weeks, but how bad they were the week before that. And really, I mean, South Carolina, more than only Georgia, has had an impact on the playoff race that's been more significant than South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina knocked Tennessee out of the playoff, and then they came and they knocked Clemson out of the playoff. And to do that after having just laid a complete egg against Florida was just a complete surprise to me. I mean, I assumed Tennessee was just going to blow them out of the water. And then even after that, I was like, well, they caught lightning in a bottle against Tennessee, and Clemson's not great. They've sort of limped their way through with Uiagalelei, but
they were getting it done week to week still. The Clemson team was figuring out ways to get it done. And
if
the way Rattler and that offense just went off, man, nobody saw that coming.
Absolutely. So that's my biggest surprise is that, except for maybe Florida losing to Vandy, that might have been a bigger surprise.
I like Beamer too. I do like him. He's hard not to like.
Especially when he started sticking it to Heupel there at the end of the game.
Yeah. Beamer's likable dude. I like what they're doing up there in Carolina. But hey, for those of you who want to bash on our team this year too, Utah and South Carolina, those are two pretty solid victories in the win column too. I'm gonna go biggest surprise, the A&M collapse. Oh man, what a season what a spectacular failure that was. And I'm telling you, man, you watch clips of their fan base, that cult. I do not want that cult to build up into a powerhouse. Let's keep them at the bottom of the West for a while, Will. I also have the Tennessee win streak that we talked about as notable. Another note I'll say Bama playing so many close games. They just were in so many games this year, and LSU winning the West, which we talked about as well. But to me, far and away, the Texas A&M just not even coming close to living up to monumental expectations was a huge storyline this year. Biggest surprise for me.
Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't really thought about A&M, but I haven't thought about them for a few weeks because they've been so bad. So
All right,
there you
least surprising result of the season. I'm going to kick this one off. Will Levis not looking like a top 10 NFL draft pick.
go.
That's the least surprising result of this. Did you see Kentucky fire the offensive coordinator, by the way?
I did, but for good reason.
Yeah, man, that just did not surprise me whatsoever. Uh, did surprise me that we lost to them because I did not have that in the preseason, but yeah, that did not. He had to. I'll tell you what. In defense of Will Levis, that Ole Miss game was not a terrible. Like he's a scrappy dude that can fight. I can see that guy being in the league for a while as a backup. I just don't see him as like Will Levis leading the Houston Texans into the playoffs as the top 5 draft. I just don't see that, man. I don't see that. But you know what? Josh Allen didn't have an awesome looking college career at all times either, right? That's always going to be the story, right?
Well, so my least surprising is that Tennessee had to put together a GoFundMe to be able to afford to put goalposts back up after the Alabama game. Like, I mean, come on, guys.
Wait, least
like
surprising?
go fish. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely expected. I didn't expect him to go fish him out of the river. Like, they had to go. That was so hilarious when they put up the GoFundMe to get to raise funds to put up new goalposts. I'm like, wow. If anything screams Tennessee, I think that screams Tennessee. And then they spent so much money on Heupel and getting rid of Pruitt and all the McDonald's bags going to all the players that it was you got the Vol Navy. They can't fish those things out of the river. Come on, what's going on here?
You got to capitalize on your first moment of happiness in a decade and a half. You got to capitalize on that moment.
So my
Just
real answer,
business.
you went with a quarterback for least surprising. I'm going to do that as well. My least surprising is that Will Rogers led the SEC in yards.
Oh, I'm sorry. What he did? What
he led the SEC in yards.
Okay.
And was the least efficient quarterback by my metric, yards above replacement. He was the worst quarterback in the SEC from the standpoint of he averaged 6.6 yards per throw. So he attempted 566 passes, and the next closest to the SEC was Stetson Bennett at 366. And so he attempted 200 more passes than Stetson Bennett, and Bennett only threw for 600 less yards.
Any comment on inventing his statistics just to slander the good name of Will Rogers?
Yes, I enjoy the fact that I get to slander Will Rogers because you thought that he was going to be fantastic. And look, I think Rogers does what he's asked to do. He's limited, and we knew that coming in, and which is why I say this is the least surprising thing. I mean, you were singing his praises, saying that Mississippi State was going to be a tough.
I'm a Leach guy. I think Leach does magic with quarterbacks. I like watching Mike Leach quarterbacks play.
Well, and look, fan. I think there are times where that Leach offense works really, really well, and you look at it and go, oh yeah. The problem is that it is a system, and the system asks the quarterbacks to be inefficient, and that inefficiency eventually costs them points. And so against truly elite teams, Mississippi State, until they find a guy who can go downfield consistently and average 8, 9, 10 yards a throw, is going to struggle and sit in that 6-6, 5-7, 7-5 range, which is exactly where they ended up this year. So again, it's not that I'm like anti Will Rogers, other than you're so pro Will Rogers. I like being the counter to you.
I've become more pro. I've become pro Will Rogers because of you.
Yeah, that's just because you want him to do well, so you can rub it in my face.
Yes, that's why. And then he goes exactly why.
Yes. And then he goes out and throws for 355 yards on 72 throws, and we get to have a discussion about efficiency versus yardage, and Anyway, so
like
least surprising, man.
This is an inefficient conversation. I feel like
because you're wrong.
I don't know, man. League leader in passing. What can you say? What can you say about that? That's pretty good.
Skip Bayless.
He was just so bad in the thing that I said before the season. I thought Mississippi State had a shot to upset either Alabama or Georgia, pull off a big upset, and I put A&M in that category. And when they beat A&M, I was like, "Fire! Hey, Will, how about that win against A&M?" That did not turn out to be. I'll own that as a wrong prediction there. But I like those Leach quarterbacks. Year 3 of the system for him. I liked what he's going to do. He led the league in passing, but unfortunately, Will has to ruin it with his statistics. I also put least surprising Auburn firing Brian Harsin. Don't think that was shocking to anybody. So Cadillac Williams, pretty good in replacement. Not all that bad. He was fun to watch on the sideline. Game of the year, Will. I think this is a pretty easy call. So give me options one and options two for you.
I mean, so obviously you got Tennessee, Alabama.
Yeah.
I think is the first one that jumps to mind, and then the other one I think is LSU, Alabama.
I have
Right?
the same two. The
I
same
mean,
two, dude.
going for two at the end for
Yeah.
LSU to win that one. I think the game itself was a little bit less entertaining, though it was more surprising. Maybe I think the Tennessee game you were sort of primed for. Hey, they might have an opportunity to get this one, but man, the back and forth on that one, just highlight reel after highlight reel, and then Tennessee being able to pull it out there at the end. I think that's probably my number one. But again, I think anytime Alabama goes down in a close game in the SEC, you're going to say that's a fantastic game, which is funny because the only one that we don't really remember is the one that Florida kind of flubbed at the end there last year against Alabama. I guess if they'd come back and won that one, then maybe we'd remember it a little bit more. But yeah, that's what I'd have. I'd have the two Alabama losses as the ones that are 1 and 2.
Bama
Though I'll
escaped
tell you,
Ole Miss.
the one that I'm just thinking about now is Missouri, Georgia.
Yes, but yeah,
That was a crappy game.
that's why I couldn't pull the trigger. Did you ever feel like Georgia was actually going to lose that game though too?
So
Like, did you really feel like at any point, like, yeah, Georgia's they're
no, well,
in
and
trouble
this is
here? I didn't
well,
really
and this
feel like that at any
now,
point
and
in
this
that
is
game.
actually where you and I get along very well. Is we both dislike Eli Drinkwitz, and little Eli was screwing that game up over and over and over again, and I'm just like, oh my god, like Eli, just for once, do the right thing, and he wouldn't, and you're right. But so that one was less exciting just because of who won. The Tennessee beating Alabama, like again, those are both my enemy, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So
Right.
I was okay with Tennessee winning that one, especially since I have a spot in my heart for Uncle Jeff and Hendon Hooker, and then you go to the LSU game, and I just honestly I just wanted to see if the post game interview was going to have a Southern accent for that one. So
Yeah, Uncle Jeff, he's also one of the surprises of the year on Read and Reaction. Him and Uncle Jeff and his hooker regret. Yeah, so that's our basic categories there. I would put the Ole Miss. You know what? Thinking about it, that Ole Miss Kentucky game was sneaky good. That was a sneaky good game. And Ole Miss Bama was pretty good too. So any Lane Kiffin's just incredibly entertaining too. So,
yeah, but
but
he's more entertaining on Twitter than watching his team win. So.
those are not. They didn't carry enough significance. Those two Bama games, I actually felt like were the two best in the league this year. So we had the exact same two. Unfortunately, there. Well, but hey, another show in the books here. That is it for the regular season. College football regular season always goes by. It flies by, doesn't it? All of a sudden, Thanksgiving experience that last weekend of the year. I hope everybody out there had a good Thanksgiving. We will check back next week for bowl season, seeing a lot of variation in the bowl. I've seen the Birmingham Bowl. I've seen the anything from. I don't think we're going to get up to the Music City Bowl. I don't think that's going to happen. But I've seen the Liberty Bowl, Birmingham Bowl, the Las Vegas Bowl against UCLA would be pretty interesting. Seeing a lot of variation in bowl projections right now, so nothing really to narrow in on overall. Will, any final words before we head out?
Nah, I mean, like you said, we only get 12 of these, so you got to appreciate it. Hopefully, they'll send us to Vegas because I think that'll be sort of a fun trip for the players. And we'll find out about Napier's discipline if they send him out to Vegas. Anybody who's not toeing the line, we will find out when they send him to Vegas. And the projection in Vegas would be UCLA, and I think that'd be a fun one.
Yeah.
So I hope we get that one. And the other thing is I think I want to thank everybody who has subscribed to YouTube here. Obviously, if you will, please like and subscribe this video. But everybody who's subscribed this year, who's followed us here on Stand Up and Holler, who's read the articles either YouTube or over at Read and Reaction, and then everybody who's supported us over on Patreon. This is a labor of love for us, but we do appreciate the fact that you all trust us for the information that we give you and the opinions that we give you, and think it's worthwhile to say thank you and how much we appreciate the participation and the fact that you let us talk about your favorite team. They're our favorite team too, but you let us do that and you help us do that by tuning in and supporting us. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, it's an absolute blast, and definitely it's a lot of fun doing this week to week, and appreciate each and every one of you watching. Anyway, thanks everybody. Have a great week, and go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.